Something I want people to understand, and it's really been weighing heavily on me for the last couple of days, this thing about misinformation and disinformation, right? And this is less about the two individuals that were tied up into it and more about the bigger picture, right? So I live in the South Carolina, but I've lived in the South most of my life. I've traveled and whatnot, been to other states. I've traveled across the country as well. But I want to say something about this idea that people are susceptible to misinformation and disinformation, and that, that's why they respond the way they do, right? This may not be a popular opinion, but it's one that I think people need to take into consideration, right? I was raised in the South, right? I went to public school here in the South. I cut my teeth in community work here in the South, right? And yes, are there challenges with getting people to access information? Absolutely. As I would imagine there are challenges anywhere. But there's a point where here we have to understand that there's a cultural system that purposely keeps people ignorant, for lack of a better term, right? There's a reason why, barring maybe one or two, southern states have the worst fucking educational rankings. Because despite all the rhetoric, it has never been the goal of southern states to create world-class educational systems that create people who are well educated. That's never been the goal. And that's because these Yahoo backwoods fucking hillbilly politicians, the Republican Party, they need a stupid populace in order to maintain the levels of control that they have, right? And I want to say something, because one thing that kept coming out during this whole Mama Todd Officer Udy situation, and people were saying, oh, well, they don't know how the government works. They may not know how the government works, but it's not because somebody didn't teach them that. The South predicates everything about the North, Democrats being bad, federal government being bad, all of that shit, right? Because they keep white people as far down the intellectual totem pole as they possibly fucking can, right? Conservatives hate the federal government till they need money, right? You hear states' rights all the fucking time until a fucking major catastrophe happens, and then here we go. All of a sudden, people know the number to the White House, except for Ron DeSantis, right? And so you got people complaining in the South. Matter of fact, let me say this, and please take this from this video. If you are a black person or a white person, and you're talking to a white person from any southern state, except maybe Georgia or North Carolina, and if they're the western part of North Carolina, this applies to them. Georgia, anything outside of Atlanta, this applies to them too. If they're talking shit about Democrats at any level, tell them to shut the fuck up. Why? Because every fucking southern state is dominated by Republicans. Not by a little bit, but by a lot. Georgia and North Carolina's congressional representation is split evenly down the middle, right? I think Georgia has 14 representatives in Washington. North Carolina has 14 representatives in Washington. And they're split 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans. Again, I may be off in one or two, but I'm almost certain. Georgia has 2 Democratic senators, which they hate. They hate that. That's why they do everything in their power to manipulate elections. And North Carolina has 2 Republican senators, right? And so one of the things that gets me in all of this, hold on. One of the things that gets me when I hear people complaining about the government's response, I'm like, and other people have said this, what the fuck were your representatives doing? Any southern state, Alabama, Arkansas, fucking Mississippi, all of those states have Republican representation. So if they don't get what the fuck they need from Washington, it's on the Republicans. And that's not misinformation. That is willful fucking ignorance. Because these people know who represents them in Washington, and if they don't need to be fucking talking about politics. And it's past time for us to call this shit out. Republicans prey on their own constituents' stupidity. They need that shit to stay in office. They need white people from the fucking backwoods of the South to believe that somehow or another, through the process of fucking mythology, Democrats have a role in their lives when they don't. Right? You got people in the backwoods of fucking deep South counties who will sit there and talk shit about the Democrats, and a Democrat hasn't represented their district since the 1800s. But they're still sitting there with this dumb shit because that's the culture that's created here. That's not misinformation. That's not disinformation. These people aren't having rational thought conversations before this. That's how they're bred. And listen, this should apply to some black people too. We got some dumbass black people down here too who don't know they asshole from a hole in the ground. And again, they're willfully ignorant because the information is sitting right there. But the South, one of the things that the worst kept secrets of the South is, in order for the power structure to exist down here, there has to be an educational system that does not afford the average person to understand how things work. That's why they want poor public schools that are still segregated to this day. They want that because they don't want black kids, which the other piece is the 50% of the black population in America is in the South. So they're not trying to create world-class educational systems. They're not. They don't want black kids to read, and they don't want white kids to read. They don't want nobody to be able to read, because then you could read the legislation that's coming through the states and what they're taking up to DC and be like, this shit don't benefit us. So when people are looking at the responses to how shit works, I'm not making any excuses for that. I'm just saying, as somebody who has lived here his entire life, that shit is on purpose. And the same people that were sitting there spewing the shit, they do that shit because they know it riles up the fucking same people that listen to these dumbass fucking conservative Republicans who've been lying to people for fucking decades. Fucking decades. Alabama has one Democrat in Washington. So does South Carolina. So does Mississippi. So how the fuck does anybody fix their mouth to say shit about a Democrat in Washington when every other representative up there is a Republican? So as a black Southern man, let me say this. It ain't fucking misinformation and disinformation. It's fucking racism and cultivated ignorance. That's what the fuck it is.